Chapter 13. Escaping from the wreck, the watchman sinking.
Well, I catched my breath and most fainted. Shut up on a wreck with such a gang as that. But it warn't no time to be sentimental any. We'd got to find that boat now, had to have it for ourselves. So we went a-quaking and shaking down the starboard side, and slow work it was, too. Seemed a week before we got to the stern. No sign of a boat. Jim said he didn't believe he could go any further, so scared he hadn't hardly any strength left, he said. But I said, come on, if we get left on this wreck, we are in a fix sure. So on we prowled again. We struck for the stern of the Texas and found it, and then scrambled along forward on the skylight, hanging on from shutter to shutter, for the edge of the skylight was in the water. When we got pretty close to the cross-hall door, there was the skiff, sure enough. I could just barely see her. I felt ever so thankful. In another second I would have been aboard her, but just then the door opened. One of the men stuck his head out only about a couple of foot from me, and I thought I was gone. But he jerked it in again and says, "Heave that blamed lantern out of sight, Bill." He flung a bag of something into the boat, and then got in himself and sat down. It was Packard. Then Bill, he come out and got in. Packard says in a low voice, "All ready. Shove off." I couldn't hardly hang on to the shutters, I was so weak. But Bill says, "Hold on. Did you go through him?" "No. Didn't you?" "No. So he's got his share of the cash yet." "Well, then, come along. No use to take truck and leave money. Say, wouldn't he suspicion what we're up to?" "Maybe he won't. But we got to have it anyway. Come along." So they got out and went in. The door slammed, too, because it was on the careen side, and in half a second I was in the boat and Jim come tumbling after me. I out with my knife and cut the rope, and away we went. We didn't touch an oar, and we didn't speak nor whisper, nor hardly even breathe. We went gliding swift along, dead silent, past the tip of the paddle box and past the stern. Then in a second or two more we was 100 yards below the wreck, and the darkness soaked her up, every last sign of her, and we was safe and knowed it. When we was 300 or 400 yards downstream, we see the lantern show like a little spark at the Texas door for a second, and we knowed by that the rascals had missed their boat, and was beginning to understand that they was in just as much trouble now as Jim Turner was. Then Jim manned the oars, and we took out after our raft. Now was the first time that I begun to worry about the men. I reckon I hadn't had time to before. I begun to think how dreadful it was, even for murderers, to be in such a fix. I says to myself, there ain't no telling but I might come to be a murderer myself yet, and then how would I like it? So I says to Jim, "The first light we see will land 100 yards below it or above it, in a place where it's a good hiding place for you and the skiff, and then I'll go and fix up some kind of a yarn, and get somebody to go for that gang and get them out of their scrape, so they can be hung when their time comes." But that idea was a failure, for pretty soon it begun to storm again, and this time worse than ever. The rain poured down, and never a light showed. Everybody in bed, I reckon. We boomed along down the river, watching for lights and watching for our raft. After a long time the rain let up, but the clouds stayed, and the lightning kept whimpering, and by and by a flash showed us a black thing ahead, floating, and we made for it. It was the raft, and mighty glad was we to get aboard of it again. We seen a light now, way down to the right on shore, so I said I would go for it. The skiff was half full of plunder which that gang had stole there on the wreck. We hustled it onto the raft in a pile, and I told Jim to float along down and show a light when he judged he'd gone about 2 mile, and keep it burning till I come. Then I manned my oars and shoved for the light. As I got down towards it, 3 or 4 more showed, up on a hillside. It was a village. I closed in above the shore light, and laid on my oars and floated. As I went by, I see it was a lantern hanging on the jackstaff of a double-hull ferry-boat. I skimmed around for the watchman, a-wondering whereabouts he slept, and by found him roosting on the bitts forward, with his head down between his knees. I gave his shoulder 2 or 3 little shoves, and begun to cry. He stirred up in a kind of a startlish way, but when he see it was only me, he took a good gap and stretch, and then he says, "Hello, what's up? Don't cry, Bub. What's the trouble?" I says, "Pap and Mam and Sis and—" Then I broke down. He says, "Oh, dang it now, don't take on so. We all has to have our troubles, and this'll come out all right. What's the matter with 'em?" "Well, are you the watchman of the boat?" "Yes," he says, kind of pretty well satisfied like. "I'm the captain, and the owner, and the mate, and the pilot, and watchman, and head deck hand, and sometimes I'm the freight and passengers. I ain't as rich as old Jim Hornback, and I can't be so blamed generous and good to Tom, Dick, and Harry as what he is, and slam around money the way he does, but I've told him a many a time that I wouldn't trade places with him, for, says I, a sailor's life's the life for me, and I'm derned if I'd live 2 mile out of town, where there ain't nothing ever going on, not for all his spondulics and as much more on top of it," says I. I broke in and says, "They's in an awful peck of trouble, and—" "Who is?" "Why, Pap and Mam and Sis and Miss Hooker, and if you'd take your ferry boat and go up there—"
"Up where? Where are they?"
"On the wreck."
"What wreck?"
"Why, there ain't but one."
"Why, you don't mean the Walter Scott?"
"Yes."
"Good land, what are they doing there, for gracious sake?"
"Well, they didn't go there a purpose."
"I bet they didn't. Why, great goodness, there ain't no chance for 'em if they don't get off mighty quick. Why, how in the nation did they ever get into such a scrape?"
"Easy enough. Miss Hooker was a-visiting up there to the town."
"Yes, Booth's Landing. Go on."
"She was a-visiting there at Booth's Landing, and just in the edge of the evening she started over with her nigger woman in the horse ferry to stay all night at her friend's house, Miss what you may call her, I disremember her name, and they lost their steering oar and swung around and went a-floating down stern first about 2 mile, and saddlebags on the wreck, and the ferryman and the nigger woman and the horses was all lost, but Miss Hooker she made a grab and got aboard the wreck. Well, about an hour after dark we come along down in our trading scow, and it was so dark we didn't notice the wreck till we was right on it, and so we saddlebags, but all of us was saved but Bill Whipple, and oh, he was the best critter. I most wished had been me, I do."
"My George, it's the beatenest thing I ever struck.
"And then what did you all do?" "Well, we hollered and took on, but it's so wide there we couldn't make nobody hear. So Pap said somebody got to get ashore and get help somehow. I was the only one that could swim, so I made a dash for it, and Miss Hooker she said if I didn't strike help sooner, come here and hunt up her uncle, and he'd fix the thing. I made the land about a mile below, and been fooling along ever since, trying to get people to do something, but they said, 'Why, in such a night and such a current, there ain't no sense in it. Go for the steam ferry. Now, if you'll go and—"
"By Jackson, I'd like to, and blame it, I don't know but I will. But who in the dingnation's a-going to pay for it? Do you reckon your pap—"
"Why, that's all right. Miss Hooker she told me particular that her Uncle Hornback—"
"Great guns, is he her uncle? Look at here, you break for that light over yonder way, and turn out west when you get there, and about a quarter of a mile out you'll come to the tavern. Tell 'em to dart you out to Jim Hornback's, and he'll foot the bill. And don't you fool around any, because he'll want to know the news. Tell him I'll have his niece all safe before he can get to town. Hump yourself now, I'm a-going up around the corner here to roust out my engineer."
I struck for the light, but as soon as he turned the corner I went back and got into my skiff and bailed her out, and then pulled up shore in the easy water about 600 yards and tucked myself in among the wood boats, for I couldn't rest easy till I could see the ferry boat start. But, take it all around, I was feeling rather comfortable on accounts of taking all this trouble for that gang, for not many would have done it. I wished the widow knowed about it. I judged she would be proud of me for helping these rapscallions, because rapscallions and deadbeats is the kind of the widow and good people takes the most interest in. Well, before long, here comes the wreck, dim and dusky and sliding along down. A kind of cold shiver went through me, and then I struck out for her. She was very deep, and I see in a minute there weren't much chance for anybody being alive in her. I pulled all around her and hollered a little, but there wasn't any answer, all dead still. I felt a little bit heavy-hearted about the gang, but not much, for I reckoned if they could stand it, I could. Then here comes the ferry boat, so I shoved for the middle of the river on a long downstream slant, and when I judged I was out of eye reach, I laid on my oars, and looked back and see her go and smell around the wreck for Miss Hooker's remainders, because the captain would know her Uncle Hornback would want them. And then pretty soon the ferry boat give it up and went for the shore, and I laid into my work and went a booming down the river. It did seem a powerful long time before Jim's light showed up, and when it did show, it looked like it was 1,000 mile off. By the time I got there the sky was beginning to get a little gray in the east, so we struck for an island and hid the raft and sunk the skiff, and turned in and slept like dead people. Chapter 14. A General Good Time. The Harem. French. By and by, when we got up, we turned over the truck the gang had stole off in the wreck, and found boots and blankets and clothes and all sorts of other things, and a lot of books and a spyglass and 3 boxes of cigars. We hadn't ever been this rich before in neither of our lives. The cigars was prime. We laid off all the afternoon in the woods talking, and me reading the books, and having a general good time. I told Jim all about what happened inside the wreck and at the ferry boat, and I said these kinds of things was adventures, but he said he didn't want no more adventures. He said that when I went in the Texas and he crawled back to get on the raft and found her gone, he nearly died, because he judged it was all up with him any way it could be fixed, for if he didn't get saved he would get drowned, and if he did get saved, whoever saved him would send him back home so as to get the reward, and then Miss Watson would sell him south, sure. Well, he was right. He was most always right. He had an uncommon level head for a nigger. I read considerable to Jim about kings and dukes and earls and such, and how gaudy they dressed, and how much style they put on, and called each other your majesty and your grace and your lordship and so on, instead of mister, and Jim's eyes bugged out and he was interested. He says, "I didn't know dey was so many of 'em. I ain't heard about none of 'em, scasely, but old King Solomon, unless you counts dem kings that's in your pack of your cards. How much do a king get?" "Get?" I says. "Why, they get $1,000 a month if they want it. They can have just as much as they want. Everything belongs to them." "Ain't that gay? And what do they got to do, Huck?" "They don't do nothing." "Why, how you talk! They just sit around." "No, is that so?" "Of course it is. They just sit around, except maybe when there's a war. Then they go to the war. But other times they just lazy round or go hawking, just hawking and Shh! Do you hear a noise?" We skipped out and looked, but it weren't nothing but the flutter of a steamboat's wheel way down, coming round the point, so we come back. "Yes," says I, "and other times when things is dull, they fuss with the Parlyment, and if everybody don't go just so, he whacks their heads off. But mostly they hang around the harem." "Round the which?" "Harem." "What's the harem?" "The place where he keeps his wives. Don't you know about the harem? Solomon had one. He had about 1,000,000 wives." "Why, yes, that's so. I done forgot it. A harem's a bo'din house, I reckon. Most likely dey has rackety times in de nursery, and I reckon de wives quarrels considerable, and dat creased the racket. Yet they say Solomon de wisest man to ever live. I don't take no stock in dat, because, why, would a wise man want to live in de midst of such a blim-blammin' all the time? No, 'deed he wouldn't. A wise man would take and build a biler factory, and then he could shut down the biler factory when he want to rest." "Well, but he was the wisest man anyway, because the widow she told me so, her own self." "I don't care what de widder say. He warn't no wise man nuther. He had some of der dad-fetchin'est ways I ever see. Does you know about that child that he was gwine to chop in two?" "Yes, the widow told me all about it." "Well, den, warn't dat the beatin'est notion in the world? You just take and look at it a minute. Dar's the stump, dar. That's one of de women. Here's you. That's the other one. I's Solomon. And this here dollar bill's the child. Before you claims it, what does I do? Does I shin round 'mongs the neighbors and find out which un you de bill do belong to, and hand it over to the right one, all safe and sound, the way that anybody that any gumption would? No, I take and whack the bill in two, and give half on it to you, and t'other half to the other woman. That's the way Solomon was going to do with the child. Now I want to ask you, what's the use of the half a bill? Can't buy nothing with it. And what is the use of a half a child? I wouldn't give a dern for 1,000,000 of them." "But hang it, Jim, you've clean missed the point. Blame it, you've missed it 1,000 mile." "Who, me?
go 'long. Don't talk to me about your pints. I reckon I knows sense when I sees it, and they ain't no sense in such doin's as that. Dispute warn't about half a child. Dispute was about a whole child, and the man that think he can settle a dispute about a whole child with a half a child don't know enough to come in out of the rain. Don't talk to me about Solomon, Huck. I knows him by the back."
"But I tell you, you don't get the point."
"Blame the point. I reckon I knows what I knows. And mind you, the real p'int is down furder. It's down deeper. It lays in the way Solomon was raised. You take a man that's got only 1 or 2 children, is that man going to be wasteful of children? No, he ain't. He can't afford it. He know how to value 'em. But you take a man that's got about 5 million children running around the house, and it's different. He as soon chop a child in 2 as a cat. They's plenty more. A child or 2, more or less, warn't no consequence to Solomon, that fetch him."
I never see such a nigger. If he got a notion in his head once, there weren't no getting it out again. He was the most down on Solomon of any nigger I ever see. So I went to talking about other things, and let Solomon slide. I told about Louis XVI that got his head cut off in France long time ago, and about his little boy the Dolphin, that would be a king, but they took and shut him up in jail, and some say he died there. Poor little chap. But some says he got out and got away and come to America. That's good. But he'll be putty lonesome. They ain't no kings here, is they, Huck?
No.
Then he can't get no situation. What he going to do?
Well, I don't know. Some of them gets on the police. Some of them learns people how to talk French.
Why, Huck, don't the French people talk the same way we does?
No, Jim, you couldn't understand a word they said, not a single word.
Well, now, I be ding-busted.
How did that come? I don't know, but it's so. I got some of their jabber out of a book. Suppose a man was to come to you and say, "Parlez-vous Francie," what would you think?
I wouldn't think nothing. I'd take and bust him over the head, that is, if he weren't white. I wouldn't allow no nigger to call me that.
Shucks, it ain't calling you anything. It's only saying, "Do you know how to talk French?"
Well, then, why couldn't he say it?
Why, he is a-saying it. That's a Frenchman's way of saying it.
Well, it's a blame ridiculous way, and I don't want to hear no more about it. There ain't no sense in it.
Look here, Jim, does a cat talk like we do?
No, a cat don't.
Well, does a cow?
No, a cow don't neither.
Does a cat talk like a cow, or a cow talk like a cat?
No, they don't.
It's natural and right for 'em to talk different from each other, ain't it?
Course.
And ain't it natural and right for a cat and a cow to talk different from us?
Why, most surely it is.
Well, then, why ain't it natural and right for a Frenchman to talk different from us? You answer me that.
Is a cat a man, Huck?
No.
Well, then, there ain't no sense in a cat talking like a man. Is a cow a man?
Or is a cow a cat?
No, she ain't neither of them.
Well, then, she ain't got no business to talk like either one or t'other of them. Is a Frenchman a man?
Yes.
Well, then, dad blame it, why don't he talk like a man? You answer me that.
I see it weren't no use wasting words. You can't learn a nigger to argue, so I quit. Chapter 15. Huck loses the raft. In the fog. Huck finds the raft. Trash. We judged that 3 nights more would fetch us to Cairo, at the bottom of Illinois, where the Ohio River comes in, and that was what we was after. We would sell the raft and get on a steamboat and go way up the Ohio amongst the free states, and then be out of trouble. Well, the second night a fog begun to come on, and we made for a towhead to tie to, for it wouldn't do to try to run in the fog. But when I paddled ahead in the canoe with a line to make fast, there weren't anything but little saplings to tie to. I passed the line around one of them right on the edge of the cut bank, but there was a stiff current, and the raft come booming down so lively she tore it out by the roots, and away she went. I see the fog closing down, and it made me so sick and scared I couldn't budge for most a half a minute, it seemed to me. And then there weren't no raft in sight. You couldn't see 20 yards. I jumped into the canoe and run back to the stern and grabbed the paddle and set her back a stroke, but she didn't come. I was in such a hurry I hadn't untied her. I got up and tried to untie her, but I was so excited my hands shook so I couldn't hardly do anything with them. As soon as I got started, I took out after the raft, hot and heavy,
right down the towhead. That was all right as far as it went, but the towhead weren't 60 yards long, and the minute I flew by the foot of it I shot out into the solid white fog, and hadn't no more idea which way I was going than a dead man. Thinks I, it won't do to paddle. First I know I'll run into the bank or a towhead or something. I got to set still and float, and yet it's mighty fidgety business to have to hold your hand still at such a time. I whooped and listened. Away down there somewhere I hears a small whoop, and up comes my spirits. I went tearing after it, listening sharp to hear it again. The next time it come I see I warn't heading for it, but heading away to the right of it, and the next time I was heading away to the left of it, and not gaining on it much either, for I was flying around this way and that and t'other, but it was going straight ahead all the time. I did wish the fool would think to beat a tin pan and beat it all the time, but he never did, and it was the still places between the whoops that was making the trouble for me. Well, I fought along, and directly I hears the whoop behind me. I was tangled good now. That was somebody else's whoop, or else I was turned around. I throwed the paddle down. I heard the whoop again. It was behind me yet, but in a different place. It kept coming, and kept changing its place, and I kept answering, till by and by it was in front of me again, and I knowed the current had swung the canoe's head downstream, and I was all right if that was Jim and not some other raftman hollerin'. I couldn't tell nothing about voices in a fog, but nothing don't look natural nor sound natural in a fog. The whooping went on, and in about a minute I come a booming down on a cut bank with smoky ghosts of big trees on it, and the current throwed me off to the left and shot by, amongst a lot of snags that fairly roared, the current was tearing by them so swift. In another second or two it was solid white and still again. I set perfectly still then, listening to my heart thump, and I reckon I didn't draw a breath while it thumped 100. I just give up then. I knowed what the matter was. That cut bank was an island, and Jim had gone down t'other side of it. It weren't no towhead that you could float by in 10 minutes. It had the big timber of a regular island. It might be 5 or 6 miles long and more than half a mile wide. I kept quiet, with my ears cocked, about 15 minutes, I reckon. I was floating along, of course, 4 or 5 miles an hour, but you don't ever think of that. No, you feel like you're laying dead still on the water, and if a little glimpse of a snag slips by, you don't think to yourself how fast you're going, but you catch your breath and think, my, how that snag's tearing along. If you think it ain't dismal and lonesome out in the fog that way by yourself in the night, you try it once, you'll see. Next, for about a half an hour, I whoops now and then. At last I hears the answer a long ways off and tries to follow it, but I couldn't do it. And directly I judged I'd got into a nest of towheads, for I had little dim glimpses of them on both sides of me, sometimes just a narrow channel between, and some that I couldn't see I knowed was there because I'd heard the wash of the current against the old dead brush and trash that hung over the banks. Well, I warn't long losing the whoops down amongst the towheads, and I only tried to chase them a little while anyway, because it was worse than chasing a jack-o'-lantern. You never knowed a sound dodge around so, and swap places so quick and so much. I had to claw away from the bank pretty lively 4 or 5 times to keep from knocking the islands out of the river, and so I judged the raft must be butting into the bank every now and then, or else it would get further ahead and clear out of hearing. It was floating a little faster than what I was. Well, I seemed to be in the open river again by and by, but I couldn't hear no sign of a whoop nowheres. I reckon Jim had fetched up on a snag, maybe, and it was all up with him. I was good and tired, so I laid down in the canoe and said I wouldn't bother no more. I didn't want to go to sleep, of course, but I was so sleepy I couldn't help it, so I thought I would take just one little cat-nap. But I reckon it was more than a cat-nap, for when I waked up the stars was shining bright, the fog was all gone, and I was spinning down a big bend stern first. First I didn't know where I was. I thought I was dreaming, and when things began to come back to me they seemed to come up dim out of last week. It was a monstrous big river here, with the tallest and thickest kind of timber on both banks, just a solid wall, as well as I could see by the stars. I looked away downstream and seen a black speck on the water. I took after it, but when I got to it, it weren't nothing but a couple of saw logs made fast together. Then I see another speck and chased that.
then another, and this time I was right. It was the raft. When I got to it, Jim was sitting there with his head down between his knees, asleep, with his right arm hanging over the steering oar. The other oar was smashed off, and the raft was littered up with leaves and branches and dirt, so she'd had a rough time. I made fast and laid down under Jim's nose on the raft and began to gap, and stretch my fists out against Jim, and says, "Hello, Jim, have I been asleep? Why didn't you stir me up?"
Goodness gracious, is that you, Huck? And you ain't dead? You ain't drowned? You's back again? It's too good for true, honey. It's too good for true. Let me look at you, child. Let me feel of you. No, you ain't dead. You's back again. Lives and sound. And just the same old Huck. The same old Huck, thank to goodness.
What's the matter with you, Jim? You been a-drinking?
Drinking? Has I been a-drinking? Has I had a chance to be a-drinking?
Well, then, what's make you talk so wild?
How does I talk wild?
How? Why, hain't you been talking about my coming back and all that stuff, as if I'd been gone away?
Huck, Huck Finn, you look me in the eye. Look me in the eye. Hain't you been gone away?
Gone away? Why, what in the nation do you mean? I ain't been gone anywheres. Where would I go to?
Well, looky here, boss. There's something wrong. There is. Is I me, or who is I? Is I here, or what is I? Now, that's what I want to know.
Well, I think you're here, plain enough, but I think you're a tangle-headed old fool, Jim.
I is I? Well, you answer me this. Didn't you tote out the line in the canoe to make fast to the towhead?
No, I didn't. What towhead? I ain't seen no towhead.
You ain't seen no towhead? Looky here. Didn't the line pull loose and the raft go a-humming down the river and leave you and the canoe behind in the fog?
What fog?
Why, the fog. The fog that's been round all night. And didn't you whoop, and didn't I whoop, and tell we got mixed up in the islands, and one of us got lost, and t'other one was just as good as lost, case he didn't know where he was. And didn't I bust up agin a lot of them islands and have a terrible time and most get drownded? Now, ain't that so, boss? Ain't it so? You answer me that.
Well, this is too many for me, Jim. I ain't seen no fog, nor no islands, nor no troubles, nor nothing. I've been setting here talking with you all night till you went to sleep about 10 minutes ago, and I reckon I done the same. You couldn't have got drunk in that time, so of course you've been dreaming.
Dad fetch it, how is I gwine to dream all that in 10 minutes?
Well, hang it all, you did dream it, because there didn't any of it happen.
But, Huck, it's all just as plain to me as—
It don't make no difference how plain it is. There ain't nothing in it. I know, because I've been here all the time.
Jim didn't say nothing for about 5 minutes, but set there studying over it. Then he says, "Well, then, I reckon I did dream it, Huck, but dog my cats if it ain't the powerfulest dream I ever see. And I ain't ever had no dream 'fore that tired me like this one."
"Oh, well, that's all right, because a dream does tire a body like everything sometimes. But this one was a staving dream. Tell me all about it, Jim."
So Jim went to work and told me the whole thing right through, just as it happened, only he painted it up considerable. Then he said he must start in and interpret it, 'cause it was sent for a warning. He said the first towhead stood for a man that would try to do us some good, but the current was another man that would get us away from him. The whoops was warnings that would come to us every now and then, and if we didn't try hard to make out to understand them, they'd just take us into bad luck stead of keeping us out of it. The lot of towheads was troubles we was going to get into with quarrelsome people and all kinds of mean folks, but if we minded our business and didn't talk back and aggravate them, we would pull through and get out of the fog and into the big clear river, which was the Free States, and wouldn't have no more trouble. It had clouded up pretty dark just after I got onto the raft, but it was clearing up again now.
"Oh, well, that's all interpreted well enough as far as it goes, Jim," I says. "But what does these things stand for?"
It was the leaves and rubbish on the raft and the smashed oar. You could see them first rate now. Jim looked at the trash, then looked at me, and back at the trash again. He had got the dream fixed so strong in his head that he couldn't seem to shake it loose and get the facts back into its place again right away. But when he did get the thing straightened around, he looked at me steady without ever smiling, and says, "What do dey stand for? I's gwine to tell you. When I got all wore out wid work, and wid de calling for you, and went to sleep, my heart was most broke because you was lost, and I didn't care no more what become me and de raft. And when I wake up and find you back again all safe and sound, de tears come, and I could have got down on my knees and kiss your foot, I's so thankful. And all you was thinking 'bout was how you could make a fool of old Jim wid a lie. Dat truck dere is trash, and trash is what people is dat puts dirt on de head of their friends and makes 'em ashamed." Then he got up slow and walked to the wigwam, and went in there without saying anything but that. But that was enough. It made me feel so mean I could almost kissed his foot to get him to take it back. It was 15 minutes before I could work myself up to go and humble myself to a nigger, but I done it, and I warn't ever sorry for it afterwards, neither. I didn't do him no more mean tricks, and I wouldn't done that one if I'd knowed it would make him feel that way.